Maya Richardson counted the crumpled bills for the third time, her fingers trembling as she spread them across the kitchen table of her cramped studio apartment. $43.16. That was everything she had left after paying the electricity bill, and rent was due in 5 days. The fluorescent light above her flickered, threatening to go out completely, just another reminder that everything in her life seemed to be hanging by a thread. Her daughter Emma slept on the pull-out couch across the room, her small chest rising and falling peacefully, completely unaware that her mother was calculating whether they could survive on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for another week. Maya had been working double shifts at Bernie's diner for 3 months straight, her feet aching constantly, her back screaming every time she bent to pick up a dropped fork or wipe down a table. The tips had been getting worse lately, and she knew why. The diner was dying. Bernie's had been a neighborhood staple for 40 years, but now the vinyl booths were cracked and patched with duct tape, the linoleum floor was stained beyond redemption, and the whole place smelled like old grease, no matter how much she scrubbed. Customers were choosing the new bistro down the street, the one with the Instagram-worthy decor and the artisanal coffee that cost $8 a cup. Maya stuffed the money back into the envelope and rubbed her eyes, fighting back tears that seemed to come more easily these days. She was 28 years old, and she felt ancient. The divorce had wiped her out financially, and Emma's father hadn't sent a child support check in 11 months. She'd applied to nursing school twice, but without money for the application fees and entrance exams, it remained a distant dream. The diner job was supposed to be temporary, just until she got back on her feet, but 3 years had passed and she was still here, still pouring coffee, and forcing smiles at customers who barely saw her as human. Her alarm would go off in 4 hours, and she'd do it all again. She'd pin on that stupid name tag, tie on that stained apron, and pretend that everything was fine. That's what you did when you had a kid, depending on you. You swallowed your pride, you ignored your exhaustion, and you kept moving forward because stopping meant falling, and falling meant losing everything. Maya looked over at Emma, her 7-year-old daughter who deserved so much better than this cramped apartment, and a mother who was too tired to help with homework most nights. Emma had asked for new shoes last week, the ones the other kids at school were wearing, and Maya had felt her heart crack when she'd had to say, maybe next month, knowing that next month would bring its own emergencies and expenses. She wondered sometimes if Emma understood how close they were to the edge, if she noticed how her mother stretched every dollar, reused every leftover, and turned off lights religiously to save on the electric bill. The weight of single motherhood pressed down on Maya's shoulders like a physical thing, and tonight it felt heavier than ever. She thought about her own mother, who'd raised 3 kids alone after Maya's father left, and how she'd never really understood the sacrifice until now. The pride her mother had maintained, the way she'd never let them see her cry or worry, now made perfect sense. Maya folded the envelope and tucked it into her purse, then walked quietly to the couch and pulled the thin blanket up over Emma's shoulders. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to make $43 stretch until Friday's paycheck. Tomorrow she'd smile at customers and pretend her feet didn't hurt. Tomorrow she'd be strong because that's what mothers did. But tonight, just for a few minutes, she let herself feel the crushing weight of it all. The morning rush at Bernie's diner started the same way it did every Tuesday. Maya tied her apron strings extra tight, grabbed her order pad, and prepared herself for the usual crowd of construction workers, retirees, and office employees grabbing breakfast before work. The bell above the door chimed constantly between 6 and 9, a steady stream of familiar faces ordering the same meals they always did. Old Joe wanted his eggs over easy with wheat toast. Miss Henderson needed her oatmeal with exactly 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, and the construction crew from the site 3 blocks down would order enough pancakes and bacon to feed a small army. Maya moved through the routine on autopilot, her body knowing the rhythm even when her mind was elsewhere, calculating bills and worrying about Emma's upcoming field trip that required a $20 permission slip. She was refilling coffee cups at table 7 when she noticed him through the window. The man stood on the sidewalk just outside the diner's entrance, staring at the menu posted on the glass with an intensity that seemed out of place. His clothes were filthy, layers of jackets and sweaters that had seen better years, and his beard was long and unkempt, streaked with gray. His shoes were held together with what looked like wire, and he carried everything he owned in a garbage bag slung over his shoulder. Maya watched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins, counting them slowly in his palm. Even from inside, she could see the disappointment on his face as he realized he didn't have enough. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the diner, and something in his expression made Maya's chest tighten. It wasn't just hunger she saw there, it was defeat, the kind that came from being invisible to the world for too long. The other customers had noticed him too, and Maya could feel the shift in the room's energy. Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse a little closer. Two businessmen at the counter exchanged glances, and one of them muttered something she couldn't quite hear, but could easily guess. This happened sometimes, homeless people coming to the door, and usually Bernie would shoo them away before they could even step inside. The diner had a reputation to maintain, he'd say, as if poverty was contagious. Maya looked at the clock. Bernie wouldn't be in for another hour. He'd been coming in later and later these past few months, leaving her to open and handle the morning rush alone. The man outside shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly trying to decide whether to come in or move on. Maya made a decision before she could second-guess herself. She walked to the door and pushed it open, the bell chiming above her head. The man looked up, surprise and weariness crossing his weathered face. He looked older up close, maybe 60, maybe 70. It was hard to tell when someone had been living rough for years, but his eyes were sharp and clear, a deep brown that seemed to hold stories she couldn't begin to imagine. He took a step back, expecting to be told to move along, but Maya smiled instead. She knew what it felt like to count coins and come up short, to stand outside looking in at something you couldn't afford. Just last week she'd done the same thing at the pharmacy, calculating whether she could afford Emma's antibiotics and still buy groceries. The man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first, just a rough clearing of his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, educated even, not what she'd expected. He said he was sorry to bother her, that he was just looking at the menu, he'd move along. Maya shook her head and held the door open wider, telling him to come in and sit down, that she'd get him some breakfast. The weariness in his eyes deepened into confusion, like he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. People didn't do things like this, not for people like him. But Maya just kept holding the door, and after a moment of hesitation, he stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of streets and unwashed clothes and a dignity that somehow survived despite everything. Maya had just set a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon and toast in front of the homeless man, when she heard Bernie's voice cut through the diner like a knife. He'd come in early for once, and from the sound of it, he was already in a foul mood. She turned to see her boss standing near the register, his face turning red as he spotted the man in booth 12. Bernie was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, wearing his usual stained white shirt and loosened tie, his hair slicked back with too much gel. He'd inherited the diner from his father, and spent most of his time complaining about how the neighborhood had changed, how nobody appreciated good honest food anymore, how he was barely keeping the lights on. Maya had heard it all 1,000 times, the same complaints about expenses and ungrateful employees and customers who didn't tip enough. Bernie's eyes locked onto the homeless man, then swung to Maya with an expression that made her stomach drop. He stormed across the diner floor, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum, and the other customers went quiet, sensing the coming confrontation. Maya tried to head him off, meeting him halfway with her hands raised in a placating gesture, but Bernie wasn't interested in explanations. His voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear when he demanded to know what the hell she thought she was doing, bringing that into his establishment. Not who but that, like the man wasn't even human. Maya felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice steady, explaining that she was just giving someone a meal, that it wasn't going to cost Bernie anything because she was paying for it herself. She'd already planned to have the cost taken out of her tips, to make it work somehow, but Bernie wasn't listening. He was on a roll now, years of frustration pouring out in a torrent of words about property values and decent customers, and how he couldn't run a charity. The homeless man had stood up from the booth, his hands raised in surrender, saying he'd leave, that he didn't want any trouble. The dignity in his voice, the way he was trying to make himself smaller, to disappear, made Maya's chest tight with fury. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Bernie was still yelling, telling the man to get out, and when he turned back to Maya, his finger was jabbing the air between them like a weapon. He told her that this was the problem with people like her, bleeding hearts who didn't understand business, who didn't get that you couldn't help everyone, and that trying to do so just brought down everyone around you. The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one landing where she was already bruised. She'd been working herself to exhaustion for this man, covering shifts when other servers called in sick, staying late to close when he wanted to leave early, and this was how he saw her, as a problem, as someone too stupid to understand how the world really worked. Something inside her snapped, that final thread that had been holding her together for months. She heard herself telling Bernie that maybe if he treated people with basic human decency, he wouldn't be losing customers to every other restaurant in the neighborhood. The words came out louder than she'd intended, and the diner went completely silent. Bernie's face went from red to purple, a vein throbbing in his forehead, and Maya realized she'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. Bernie's voice dropped to something cold and controlled when he told her she was fired, that she should get her things and get out of his diner right now. Maya stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her like ice water. She'd just lost her job, lost the only source of income keeping her and Emma afloat, and for what? For giving a homeless man breakfast. The rational part of her brain screamed that she'd been stupid, reckless, that she couldn't afford to lose this job no matter how much Bernie deserved to be called out. But another part of her, the part that was tired of being small and scared and invisible, felt something like relief. Maya sat on the concrete steps outside Bernie's diner for 20 minutes before she could make herself stand up. Her apron was balled up in her hands, the name tag still pinned to it, reflecting the afternoon sun. She'd cleaned out her locker, grabbed the $46 in tips from her pocket that she'd earned that morning, and walked out without looking back. The homeless man had already gone, disappeared back into the city before Bernie could do anything worse than yell. Maya hoped he'd at least gotten to eat some of that breakfast before everything went sideways. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen, knowing she needed to make calls, needed to start looking for another job immediately, but her fingers wouldn't move. The weight of what she'd done pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd just thrown away steady employment, terrible as it was, for a principal, for a stranger, and now Emma would pay the price. The rational thing would have been to keep her head down, to let Bernie kick the man out, to pretend she hadn't seen anything wrong with it. That's what survival looked like sometimes, choosing your battles, protecting yourself, and your kid above all else. But Maya couldn't shake the image of that man's face, the defeat in his eyes, the way he'd tried to make himself smaller when Bernie started yelling. She'd seen that same expression in the mirror too many times lately, that look of someone who was drowning and knew nobody was going to throw them a rope. Maybe that's why she'd done it, not for him but for herself, to prove that she hadn't completely given up on being the person she wanted to be. The problem was that person couldn't pay rent. Maya finally forced herself to stand and start walking home, each step feeling heavier than the last. She'd have to tell Emma tonight that things were going to be tight for a while, that they might need to move again, maybe find somewhere cheaper, though she couldn't imagine anywhere cheaper that wasn't actively dangerous. The studio they had now was in a decent neighborhood with a good school, and Emma had friends there, stability that Maya had fought hard to provide. The thought of uprooting her daughter again, of seeing that resigned understanding in a 7-year-old's eyes, made Maya feel physically sick. She stopped at a coffee shop window and stared at the help wanted sign taped to the glass. Barista needed, flexible hours, experience preferred. She took a picture of the phone number with shaking hands, then kept walking, cataloging every help wanted sign she passed. By the time she reached her apartment building, she'd photographed 8 different job postings, from retail positions to cleaning services, to another diner across town. None of them would hire her quickly enough to make Friday's rent payment, but maybe she could scrape together enough to buy a few more days, to give herself time to find something. The apartment felt different when she walked in, emptier somehow, like the walls knew what had happened, and were already preparing to close in on her. Emma's drawings were stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, bright crayon pictures of houses and families, and sunshine that seemed to mock the situation Maya had created. She'd promised Emma that things were getting better, that they just needed to hang on a little longer, and everything would work out. She'd promised that they were safe here, that they wouldn't have to move again. Those promises felt hollow now, just words she'd used to convince herself as much as her daughter. Maya sank onto the couch and let herself have 5 minutes to fall apart. 5 minutes to cry, to rage at the unfairness of it all, to wish she'd made different choices. Then she wiped her eyes, opened her laptop and started filling out job applications. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, submitting her resume to every posting she could find within a reasonable bus route. Her phone rang twice while she worked, both calls from unknown numbers that she answered with forced cheerfulness, but neither one was about a job. By the time Emma got home from school, Maya had applied to 14 positions and heard back from exactly none of them. 3 weeks passed like a slow-motion car crash. Maya had burned through her savings, all $43 of it, plus the tips she'd walked out of Bernie's with, and she was now exactly 11 days late on rent. Her landlord, Miss Chen, had been patient so far, mainly because she'd always paid on time before this, but patience only stretched so far when money was involved. She'd landed 2 job interviews, both of which had seemed promising until the employers called Bernie for a reference and suddenly decided to go with other candidates. Maya knew what Bernie was telling them. She could imagine his voice dripping with false concern as he explained that she was unreliable, insubordinate, not the kind of employee you wanted representing your business. It didn't matter that she'd worked herself to exhaustion for 3 years, that she'd never called in sick, that customers had specifically asked for her because she remembered their oars and made them feel seen. None of that mattered now. She was just another cautionary tale about what happened when you didn't know your place. Emma knew something was wrong. Of course she did. Kids always knew more than parents gave them credit for. She'd stopped asking for things, had started eating smaller portions at dinner without being told, and had offered to help Maya count change one night when she thought her mother wasn't watching. 7 years old, and already learning that life could be cruel and arbitrary, that doing the right thing didn't always work out the way it was supposed to in storybooks. Maya had started selling things, little items at first, books she'd read and movies they never watched, but then bigger things, the microwave that barely worked anyway, some jewelry from her marriage that she'd kept for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Each sale bought them a few more days, a little more time, but she could see the finish line approaching, and knew she wasn't going to make it. The job search had expanded beyond restaurant work into anything she was remotely qualified for, which turned out to be not much when you'd spent the last 3 years serving eggs and coffee. She'd applied to be a receptionist, a retail clerk, a warehouse stocker, even a dog walker, sending out her resume like messages in bottles, hoping one would land somewhere that mattered. The rejection emails, when they bothered to send them at all, were always polite and generic, thanking her for her interest and wishing her well in her future endeavors, like she was choosing between exciting opportunities instead of desperately trying to keep a roof over her daughter's head. Maya had started waking up at 3 in the morning, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. They could move in with her sister in Nevada, but Diane had 3 kids of her own in a 2-bedroom apartment and barely made rent herself. There were shelters, but the thought of taking Emma to one made Maya physically ill. She'd grown up hearing horror stories about those places, about families separated and belongings stolen, and worse things she didn't want to think about. She could try to find her ex-husband, track him down and demand the child support he owed, but that would take time and money for lawyers she didn't have, and Mark had proven over and over that he was a master at avoiding responsibility. The options narrowed every day until they felt less like choices and more like inevitabilities. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table for 3 hours, laptop open to yet another job search site, when Emma came home from school with a notice about picture day. $20 for a basic package with order forms due by Friday. Maya looked at the paper, at her daughter's hopeful face, and felt something inside her crack a little more. She couldn't remember the last time they'd had professional pictures taken, couldn't remember the last time she'd been able to say yes to something Emma wanted without having to calculate the cost against groceries and electricity. She told Emma she'd think about it, and watched her daughter's face fall into that too mature expression of understanding, like she'd already known the answer before asking. That night, after Emma was asleep, Maya did something she swore she'd never do. Robert Mitchell stood on the sidewalk outside Bernie's diner and barely recognized it. The place had deteriorated even more in the 3 weeks since he'd been here, since that morning that had changed something fundamental inside him. The awning was more faded, the windows dirtier, and through the glass he could see maybe half a dozen customers scattered across the booths. Nothing like the bustling breakfast crowd that had been here before. He adjusted his Tom Ford suit jacket, ran a hand through his silver hair, and felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This had been a long time coming, years in the making really, but that morning with the waitress had crystallized something he'd been avoiding. Robert had been living on the streets for 4 months, a self-imposed exile from a life that had become unbearable. He was the founder and CEO of Mitchell Ventures, a private equity firm with assets in the billions, and he'd walked away from all of it after his wife died. Grief had hollowed him out, left him unable to face the empty mansion, the pitying looks from colleagues, the endless social obligations that felt meaningless without Catherine beside him. So he'd disappeared, left his assistant a note saying he needed time, and vanished into the city with nothing but the clothes on his back. He'd wanted to understand something, to strip away all the privilege and protection his wealth provided, and see what the world looked like from the bottom. It had been brutal and enlightening in equal measure, sleeping in shelters, scrounging for food, being invisible to the same kind of people he'd once been. But that morning at the diner, when that waitress had looked at him like he was human, had risked her job to give him dignity, something had shifted. He'd watched her get fired, had seen her boss treat her like garbage, and he'd walked away feeling ashamed. He had the power to change things, to make a difference, and he'd been wallowing in his own pain instead. That night he'd called his assistant, arranged to be picked up, and spent the next 3 weeks making calls, gathering information, and putting together a plan. Now he was back, dressed in a suit that cost more than most people made in a month, about to walk into that diner one more time. Robert pushed open the door and the bell chimed above his head, the same sound as before, but everything else was different. Bernie was behind the counter, looking older and more worn than he had 3 weeks ago, and his head snapped up when Robert walked in. There was no recognition in Bernie's eyes. Why would there be? The transformation was complete. Robert wasn't a homeless man anymore. He was exactly what he looked like, someone with money and power and the confidence that came from wielding both. He walked to the counter and asked to speak to the owner, his voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and negotiation. Bernie straightened up, suddenly attentive in the way people were when they sensed money, and said that he was the owner, asking how he could help. Robert smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He introduced himself, pulled a business card from his pocket, and watched Bernie's face go pale as he read the name. Mitchell Ventures wasn't just any equity firm. They owned restaurants, retail chains, commercial properties across the country. Bernie's hand shook slightly as he held the card, and Robert could see his mind racing, trying to figure out why someone like Robert Mitchell was standing in his failing diner. Robert didn't make him wait long. He explained that he was interested in purchasing the property, that he'd done his research and knew Bernie was 3 months behind on his mortgage, that the diner was hemorrhaging money and wouldn't survive another year. He laid out the facts with the cold precision of someone who'd made a career out of identifying failing businesses and deciding their fate. Bernie's face went through several emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally a calculating greed that Robert had expected. The number Robert offered was generous, more than fair actually, enough to clear Bernie's debts and leave him with a comfortable cushion, but there were conditions. Maya was walking past Bernie's diner on her way to yet another job interview when she saw the commotion. There were people inside she didn't recognize, suits and clipboards, the kind of professional invasion that meant something big was happening. She slowed down, curiosity overcoming her desire to avoid the place that had caused her so much pain. Through the window she could see Bernie looking smaller somehow, diminished, while a tall man with silver hair gestured around the dining room like he owned it. Then the man turned, and Maya's heart stopped. It was him, the homeless man from 3 weeks ago, except he wasn't homeless anymore. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, his beard was trimmed, his hair styled, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. Maya stood frozen on the sidewalk, trying to reconcile the defeated man who'd stood in this same spot counting coins, with the businessman conducting what looked like a corporate takeover. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more improbable than the last, until finally the man looked up and saw her through the window. His face broke into a genuine smile, and he immediately walked to the door and pushed it open. He said her name, Maya, like they were old friends, and she realized she'd never actually told him her name that morning. He must have remembered it from her name tag. He asked if she had a few minutes to talk, his voice warm but professional, and Maya found herself nodding even though she had an interview in 20 minutes that she couldn't afford to miss. Robert, he introduced himself properly now, led her back inside the diner where Bernie stood near the register looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Robert explained everything then, in clear, simple terms that Maya's shocked brain struggled to process. He told her about his company, about his wife's death and his decision to live on the streets, about the morning she'd given him breakfast and what it had meant to him. He'd come back, bought the diner from Bernie, and now he had a proposition for her. The diner was going to be renovated, completely overhauled into something the neighborhood actually needed. Robert had seen the gentrification happening, the way long-time residents were being priced out, and he wanted to create a place that would serve the community, not exploit it. He needed someone to manage it, someone who understood what it was like to struggle, who treated people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. He wanted Maya to run the new restaurant, with a real salary, benefits, and a stake in the business. Maya felt like she was in a dream, the kind where good things happened, but you knew you'd wake up any second and it would all disappear. She heard herself asking stupid questions. Why her? Why this? Was this really happening? And Robert answered each one patiently. He'd spent the last 3 weeks, not just buying the diner, but investigating her, talking to regular customers, who all said the same things about how kind she was, how hard she worked, how she'd made them feel sick. He'd tracked down her landlord and paid her back rent, and next 3 months, had enrolled Emma in a program his foundation ran for single-parent families that provided scholarships and after-school care. He'd done all of this before even talking to her because he'd learned that sometimes people needed help before they were ready to ask for it. Maya's legs went weak, and she had to sit down in one of the cracked vinyl booths, the same booth where she'd served Robert breakfast before her life fell apart, except her life hadn't fallen apart, had it? It had been falling apart for years, and she'd just been too proud or too scared to admit it. This moment, this impossible generous moment, felt like someone had finally caught her mid-fall and said it was okay to stop fighting alone. 6 months later, Maya stood in the center of what had been Bernie's diner and barely recognized it. The renovation had transformed the space into something both modern and welcoming, with booth seating reupholstered in deep blue fabric, new floors that gleamed under Edison bulb lighting, and walls painted in warm cream tones decorated with local artwork. The old grease smell was gone, replaced with the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread. But more than the physical changes, the atmosphere had shifted into something Maya had never experienced in her years of restaurant work. This was a place where everyone was welcome, where the businessman in the suit sat next to the construction worker in paint-stained jeans, where families brought their kids and elderly neighbors came for the early bird special, and nobody was made to feel less than anyone else. Maya walked through the dining room during the dinner rush, checking on tables not as a waitress but as the general manager and part owner of Riverside Community Kitchen. The name had been her idea, suggested during one of the many planning meetings with Robert, where he'd insisted on her input for every decision. She'd been terrified at first, convinced she'd fail, that she had no business running a restaurant when her only experience was serving food in wine. But Robert had been patient, had enrolled her in management courses, paired her with a consultant who taught her about inventory and staffing and profit margins, and most importantly, had trusted her instincts about what the community needed. The menu reflected that trust, featuring affordable comfort food alongside healthier options, with a sliding scale policy that allowed people to pay what they could afford. They partnered with local food banks and shelters, providing meals for those who needed them, and employed people who had barriers to traditional employment, including former homeless individuals who Robert had met during his time on the streets. Emma was thriving too. Her daughter had blossomed in the past 6 months with the stability that came from knowing where their next meal was coming from having new school supplies and clothes that fit, from seeing her mother smile more often. She came to the restaurant after school sometimes, doing homework in a corner booth while Maya worked, and the staff had adopted her as an unofficial mascot. Maya had been able to enroll in online nursing courses, studying late at night after Emma was asleep, finally pursuing the dream she'd put on hold for so long. Robert stopped by the restaurant at least once a week, usually during the lunch rush, always ordering the special and leaving generous tips that went into the staff pool. He and Maya had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by that morning when their lives had intersected in such an unexpected way. He'd told her once that saving the diner had saved him too, had given him a purpose again after months of drift. His company had started a whole division focused on community-centered businesses, using his resources to create opportunities in underserved neighborhoods, and it had all started here, with a waitress who'd been kind to a stranger. The evening rush was slowing down when Maya noticed a young woman standing outside, staring at the help wanted sign in the window with the same desperate hope Maya remembered feeling too many times. The woman's clothes were wrinkled, her expression exhausted, and Maya recognized that look of someone hanging on by their fingernails. She walked to the door and pushed it open, the bell chiming above her head, and smiled at the stranger who looked up with startled eyes. Maya asked if she was interested in the position, and when the woman nodded hesitantly, Maya held the door open wider and invited her in. They'd talk about experience and availability. She'd get the woman's information and probably a job, because they were always looking for good people. But first she'd do what someone had once done for her. She'd offer the woman a meal, treat her with dignity, and show her that sometimes help came from the most unexpected places, and that one act of kindness could change everything.